NWA All-Star Wrestling was a professional wrestling promotion based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance from the early 1960s until 1985, when promoter Al Tomko pulled the promotion from the NWA and created his own sanctioning body called the UWA. Although other wrestling promotions existed in Vancouver prior to the early 1960s, All-Star became the longest-lived and perhaps best remembered of all the promotions operating in the Vancouver area before or since. The promotion began gaining popularity aroaround the time CHAN-TV began broadcasting their TV program called All-Star Wrestling in 1962, when Gene Kiniski arrived in Vancouver and became a regular in the territory, and along with Sandor Kovacs and Don Owens, ran the territory until the early 1980s when it was purchased by Al Tomko, who made himself the top star despite having limited wrestling skills and being way past his prime. All-Star Wrestling left the NWA in 1985 when Al Tomko became involved in a promotional feud with Stu Hart, and as mentioned, Tomko then created his own sanctioning body called the Universal Wrestling Alliance, complete with on-air representative, a 16-year-old Mauro Ranallo. The promotion ceased operations in the late 1980s when BCTV Channel 11 stopped airing its weekly shows and was replaced by WWF programming. Other recognizable faces in the area along with Gene Kiniski were John Tenta, Velvet McIntyre, and even the Honky Tonk Man. This is the untold story of All-Star Wrestling. It was 1904, as Ford produced its first Model B and C automobile. The Great Fire of Toronto burns down virtually all of the downtown core. The Ottawa Silver Seven win the Stanley Cup, and regular professional wrestling matches began being held in the Vancouver Opera House, seeing mat stars such as Matty Matsuda and Sinclair Swanson, who had a bitter rivalry the early 1900s. In 1906, Seattle Chief of Police Wappenstein declared to weed out wrestling fakes by inspecting every match. A few years later, Wappy Wappenstein was convicted of accepting bribes and sentenced to 10 years in the Walla Walla Penitentiary. By 1912, Vancouver Athletic Club was also holding regular matches and regularly turning hundreds away. Throughout this time, both boxing and wrestling matches were frequently held on the same cards, and many boxers like Jack Dempsey tried their hand at wrestling, while wrestlers like George Hackenschmidt took their chances in a boxing match. By 1920, Vancouver would see stars such as Frank Gotch, Ted Thigh, George Hackenschmidt, Ernest Rober, and Doone Gillis. In 1934, World War I veteran George Fitch began promoting shows in the area, holding his first show on December 13, 1934 at the Auditorium. Through the 1940s, Cy Williams, Brother Jonathan, Jumpin' Joe Savoldi, and Hal Rumberg would all pass through the territory. In the 1940s, the city of Seattle refused to issue any permits for professional wrestling, which forced fans and wrestlers alike to head further north to Vancouver. Throughout the 1950s, professional wrestling in British Columbia could be viewed on Saturday nights on prime time at 8:30 and again at 11 on KVO West Channel 12. During the early 1950s, Cliff Parker and Ron Fenton were the main promoters in the territory before selling it to the trio of Sandor Kovacs, Gene Kiniski, and Don Owen in 1968. At that time, All-Star began the NWA British Empire Heavyweight title, which was the top title in the Vancouver territory. However, after the British Empire title was abandoned sometime after 1963, with Gene Kiniski being the final champion. All-Star Wrestling had no singles titles of its own until 1970, when the Pacific Coast Heavyweight title was reactivated. Billed as Canada's greatest athlete, Gene Kiniski started out playing football for the Edmonton Eskimos until he was recruited into the world of professional wrestling in 1952 and trained by Dory Funk, and later would become multiple-time world champion. Kiniski would wrestle the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Vern Gagne and Lou Thez, and would become NWA champion. In 1968, Kiniski was reported exhausted and agreed to drop the title to Dory Funk Jr., but behind the scenes was co-owner of All Star Wrestling. All Star Wrestling became a serious force in the Pacific Northwest wrestling scene during Kiniski's reign as NWA World Heavyweight Champion, when he and Sandor Kovacs, along with Portland promoter Don Owen, joined forces to promote the territory in the beginning of 1968, forming Northwest Wrestling Promotions as a parent company to run All Star. During this time, the promotion shared talent, including many of sports' big names at the time, with Owen's nearby NWA affiliate, Pacific Northwest Wrestling, while also developing local talent. At the same time, the All-Star Wrestling program began to be seen across Canada via syndication. Ron Morier was the original host of the TV show and served in the capacity until his death on August 6, 1981. After that, former C-Fun disc jockey Ed Carl took over as the host for the remainder of the show's run on CHAN-TV. Sandor Kovacs promoted his final All-Star show on January 17, 1977, before selling his share in the promotion to Al Tomko, a veteran wrestler and former Winnipeg promoter for the AWA. While the promotion managed to hold steady through the late 1970s following the sale, All-Star began going into decline by the early 1980s, due partly to the aging Al Tomko, who was physically past his prime and had poor wrestling skills, pushing himself as the company's top star, and partly the rise of the WWF around the middle of the decade, a situation which actually affected many other North American promotions besides All Star. Late in the promotion's NWA affiliation, during episodes of All Star Wrestling, Tomko and Ed Carl would also present and commentate on highlight clips of matches from fellow NWA affiliates, Central States Wrestling, and Jim Crockett Promotions, as well as matches taped at All Star's main house shows in Vancouver and Cloverdale. After a solid 18-month run in Japan for All Japan Pro Wrestling, Surrey native John Tenta returned home and made his North America Pro Wrestling debut in All Star Wrestling. A gold medal amateur wrestler and former sumo wrestler, and undefeated in both sports, has been described by Bret Hart as being one of the toughest guys in the locker room. Standing 6'6" and weighing well over 400 pounds, John would dominate anyone he stepped into the ring with. John feuded with King Kong J.R. Bundy before making his way to the World Wrestling Federation in 1989, being billed as a Canadian Earthquake, and later just Earthquake and managed by Jimmy Hart. Noticing the decline of the promotion, Gene Kiniski sold his ownership stake and got out sometime around 1983, promoting shows in Vancouver in association with Stampede Wrestling and the AWA. Rumor has it he was disgusted with the way Al Tomko made himself the main event. After finishing high school and moving to Oregon in 1980, Velvet McIntyre began training under Sandy Barr. Velvet soon joined All Star Wrestling and began feuding against Princess Victoria. This feud would not last long, however. Velvet McIntyre and Princess Victoria would form a tag team and eventually capture the NWA Women's Tag Team Championship, and upon joining the World Wrestling Federation in 1982, recognized as the first ever WWF Women's Tag Team Champions. Velvet McIntyre would later compete in AWA and Stampede Wrestling before returning to British Columbia and wrestling throughout the 1990s, where she won several titles before retiring in 1998. Other stars in the area at the time were Michelle Starr, Diamond Timothy Flowers, Ole Olsen, Rocky Della Sera, Billy Two Eagles, Mike Edwards, Moondog Moretti, Buddy Wayne, and King Kong J.R. Bundy, who, according to Al Tomko, looked more like the real King Kong Bundy than Bundy himself. Along with managers Jonathan Sayers and Neil Drummond, referees Gary Allen and Susie Tanner, and play-by-play announcer Ed Carl and Mauro Ranallo. In late 1985, Tomko withdrew All-Star from the NWA and created a new sanctioning body for the company called the Universal Wrestling Alliance, and introduced a 16-year-old Mauro Ranallo as its representative, who for several months claimed he was working on a report which never surfaced. Like most wrestling programs in this era, shows were recorded over every week to save money, so most footage that exists is VHS tapes owned by fans and some of the talent. The promotion also changed hands several times owned by Fred Roselli and later Neil Drummond. Those changes did nothing to reverse All Star's fortunes, however, and the promotion would eventually cease operations, holding its final event in Elk Grove, British Columbia on July 2, 1989. All Star Wrestling was later resurrected and is currently run by Michelle Starr. Shows are still being held at the Cloverdale Fairgrounds and all over British Columbia. That was the untold story of NWA All Star Wrestling.
When I play Poncho, you get ripped out and rolled out. Know what I'm talking about? Creep out, you sneak out, scientists keep out, do like Randy Savage and freak out. You sold out and smoked out. Your dad should have pulled out, bust in your mom's mouth. Know what I'm talking about?